of investment. We are now being recorded. So we've been trying to explore why is it that the system is so resistant to investing in local efforts. And that led us on a journey to consult with our partners, consult with local actors from over 50 countries, where we asked them what they saw as the problems in the system, where they see the blockages. And that led to a publication of a report called Time to Decolonize Aid that we released almost 3 years ago now. And it became really clear that there are some hidden problems in the system, barely discussed, one of them being structural racism, that there's a real problem of neo-colonial attitudes that are embedded and infused into the system that global North actors hold, and are also internalized by global South actors. But actually, these entrenched ways of working have led to a system where global North actors feel that they're the self-appointed experts in all things, and that it's their job to save others, and that it is their job to provide the resources and the expertise to communities who lack that agency and who lack the power and who lack the technical expertise. And so that was, for us, a real moment of revelation about 3 years ago where we started to ask the question around structural racism, power imbalances, and how much of this needs to change. And the message that we received loud and clear from actors, local actors around the world is, this is a problem. We need to dismantle these neo-colonial attitudes, and we need to dismantle those practices, and we need to change the power imbalances. And that's where we started on this journey of decolonizing. So for us, decolonizing really does mean dismantling those attitudes, those practices, and those power imbalances that are so deeply entrenched in the way in which the international sector works, international cooperation currently functions. But it doesn't just stop there. Decolonizing isn't just an act of dismantling. It's also, very importantly, an act of reclaiming and rebuilding. If we only look at the dismantling side, I think it can be quite a negative framing for what is, I think, a radical proposition for changing the way in which the system operates. So when we talk about decolonizing, we are saying, yes, we have to find a way of really shifting the power to local actors, but also making sure that those deeply problematic attitudes about whose knowledge matters, whose expertise matters, and where the power sits, all of that has changed. And we have to look at rebuilding and reclaiming. And we need to do that in terms of rebuilding and reclaiming power, so that the power sits with local communities and local activists, rebuilding and reclaiming agency, so that they feel that they absolutely have the agency and ability to chart their own futures, and rebuilding and reclaiming dignity, so that we restore dignity into international cooperation, rather than this very old-fashioned sense of some groups in the global North, through their generosity and their charity, helping others less fortunate. So that's what, for us, decolonizing is both the dismantling and the rebuilding. And for the last 3 years, Peace Direct has really been exploring this with local actors from around the world. And it's really become clear to us that this is a taboo subject. It's still very difficult to talk about. People are still very nervous about the implications of saying this aloud, because, talking about power and talking about structural racism and talking about neo-colonial attitudes is not easy. And what we're hearing is that many groups, actors, and activists are still afraid to say that because they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to lose the small amount of funding they already receive. So I think the momentum is building, and this is a conversation we believe that isn't going away. But we also, I hope, will have the opportunity today to talk about how we can build momentum, be the best allies we can for those who want to speak out about the dysfunctions in the system, and really try and make sure that then shifts into practice, so that we really bring not only all the actors in the system together to recognize the problems, but that we can build a new type of international cooperation system together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Appreciate that. I really love how you named both dismantling, but also rebuilding and reclaiming, so that we really can shift those power structures by dismantling them and rebuilding them where folks have, you know, the power really resides with local actors. So thank you for naming that. I quickly dove in, just a point of introduction, Amber Banks. I am the Vice President of Programs with Decolonizing Wealth Project. I'm based in Nashville here in the US. And I'm excited to pass it over to my colleague, Carlos, who's going to share a little bit about our work around decolonizing. Go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Amber. It's great to be with you all here. This is Carlos with the Decolonizing Wealth Project, based and calling in from Brooklyn, New York, USA. It's so good to see some new faces, maybe some familiar faces. And as Dylan said, we're building on an earlier conversation we had this morning with other partners and actors like you all across the world. So I wanted to share a couple of minutes of what the Decolonizing Wealth Project is about and what does it mean to us to decolonize philanthropy, wealth, cooperation. And I'll share that our journey as an organization really started in 2018 when our founder and CEO, Edgar Villanueva, who is an indigenous leader in US philanthropy, wrote a tell-all book called Decolonizing Wealth. It pulled the curtains back on the mysterious world of US philanthropy. And it really ignited a movement that had been, boiling and burning in the grassroots in the global South for decades, right, around decolonization.
Et il a établi dans les bases parce que les communautés avaient peur d'en parler, pour parler de la redistribution du pouvoir et des ressources, et ce moment a été très important qu'un leader et un expert dans la philanthropie
pudesse sair do nicho e falasse: esse é um sistema descolonialista que deve ser descolonizado nos 5 anos.
Trabajando en nuestra misión, que es realmente redistribuir y redirigir los flujos actuales de capital y el capital controlante. Y lo que hacemos específicamente es redistribuir y devolver recursos que se le han arrebatado a comunidades.
We want to make that explicit because one of the most important parts of this conversation around decolonizing is to make what has been hidden, to make what has been made implicit, explicit. And that's to say that we are, in essence, operating in a system across the world where colonization and enslavement have created vast wealths, right? And this vast wealth is the origin of what we know as global North philanthropy, which we know controls over 90% of the resources across the world. So these dynamics are at the root of our sector's problems, and we believe that the root cause has to be addressed. And so we do this through 3 particular areas. We do this through philanthropy, philanthropic advocacy and practice. We do this through racial healing. And we also do this through, I'm just going to throw on a couple of slides for people to really be able to visualize this. Our work is really centered on how do we heal so that we can take on and build new systems of being, really around storytelling, so we can start to actually shed the truth and uplift stories coming from Black and Indigenous communities in the US across the world. And arguably more importantly, we're modeling what modern philanthropy should look like by building an Indigenous and Black-led philanthropic infrastructure where we can both redistribute resources, but also model to philanthropy. This is what philanthropy should look like. And I think that's really important. At the root of what we're arguing for is for philanthropy to own its origins of wealth, meaning to acknowledge where the wealth extraction happened, how it happened, to whom and what communities it happened, and to actually own up to that. So that's what we call the reparative philanthropic model. Through our fund, Liberated Capital, we've been able to redistribute around $15 million to Black and Indigenous communities exclusively. But beyond that, we have pushed philanthropy and leveraged more than 600 million towards racial justice in the last 2 years, specifically to Black and Indigenous communities. We think this is a really a significant shift, and we're seeing that the sector, for the first time in a while, is really starting to listen to what grassroots activists and community leaders have been calling for many, many years. We also know that healing is really important, and we started to hear that in this morning's conversation, is that colonization is not just a practice or a system, it's also a way of being, and it has kind of infiltrated our ways of being, both people with institutional power and money, global North actors, but it's also seeped into the way that we operate, perhaps as global South actors or as people of color, Black, Indigenous, etc. So we know that healing, taking on the work of undoing what we've learned and reclaiming the lost knowledge from our communities is a really important part of this work. And then, of course, narrative and storytelling is so important for us to continue to uplift the work and the brilliance, as Amber said, and expertise of Black and Indigenous communities in the United States and across the global South. You know, I want to just emphasize here again that a huge part of this work and of decolonizing global cooperation is naming the root cause of disparities of wealth. We know again that colonization and enslavement led to the creation of vast wealth, which is now being hoarded, protected, and then even grown in the global North, and still primarily for the benefit of the global North. And so specifically, when we start to look at decolonizing wealth, it's really about addressing colonial dynamics in the system. And so these are some of the questions we are posing to the sector and pressuring the sector to answer. Who has power, right? Who has money? Where did the money come from? Who decides? Who benefits? And who is valued as an expert? We also ask, how is power operating? What are we seeing around forced assimilation, tokenism in practice, particularly of Black and Indigenous and people of color leaders in the sector, the ways in which evaluation is weaponized, the ways in which we don't see accountability or codes of conduct, the creation of competitive environments, and as we spoke earlier, the internalized oppression that we ourselves have to shed in order to decolonize the system. And we also ask, how is money being used? How are investments and endowments being used? How are grants being redistributed? How are funding in silos and putting people and issues and communities into restrictive and imaginary silos? And ultimately, how do we redistribute that money so that it goes back to the communities from where it was stolen? I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Amber.
Thank you, Carlos. Wow, there's just so much there, so rich. Just really appreciate you naming this reparative approach that Decolonizing Wealth is using, and really lifting up. If you haven't read Edgar's book, Decolonizing Wealth, it's definitely worth a look, and unpacks all this even more. With that, I'm going to pass it to our next speaker. Musarat, are you on the line? I'd love to go to you from Adeso. Musarat, please.
Hi, yes. Hi, everybody. It is great. Thank you, Dylan, for the framing, and Carlos, that was very rich. It reminded me of a feminist piece at some point that I was reading, and there was a quote by Amy Poehler, and she said, you know, you live life, and then 30 years later, you're undoing the baggage of your first 30 years. And I think very much in terms of when we speak about decolonization, you know, it is the recognition and dismantling of colonial powers, but the norms are so deep set that sort of undoing those, that is part of the story. I had joined the first session as well, and there was a conversation around how people are at different levels in their understanding of decolonization. And, you know, I hope we get to sort of unpack that a little bit later as well. But again, to what Carlos was saying, the undoing and the reclaiming as well, that is, you know, there's a work that we do externally that we call out, you know, the power dynamics, but there's work that also needs to be done within the communities as well, because essentially what the colonizers have done, or what decolonization essentially needs to do, is to put trust back into the communities. And what the project really has been completely stripping local communities out of them trusting themselves, that the solutions lie with them. And this is a whole project in convincing them that actually they can do this. I am with Adeso. I do communications and advocacy work with them. And, when to speak of Adeso, I would like to also speak a little bit about sort of where we come from, because what I really want to get to at is we're at a very interesting sort of the cusp of transformation for us. We are over 30 years old, and our work initially started with Fatima Jibril. A lot of you have heard of Digan Ali. So she's Digan's mother, and the work was rooted in environmental work, working with local pastoral community. And after a couple of years, when Degan had joined, so one of her key work was she had pioneered cash transfers. And this was, again, something that was, standardized, turned into a manual, and she went ahead and trained 150 other organizations within the humanitarian aid community. And what then kind of subsequently happened, and has been about 10, 15 years of advocacy efforts that Degan has led single-handedly. And a lot of that is then, what people would say localization, which Dylan, you also called it out for being a sanitized way of doing decolonization. And I can tell you Degan herself has a problem with it, mainly in that this was a word that was coined without the contribution of Global South representatives having a stake in developing the concept as well. And in doing so, she has, Adeso has played a role in the 25% sort of grand bargain target. And a lot of that then brings us to the work we're doing today, which is, Pledge for Change. Again, that is a way to advocate with INGOs in transforming the humanitarian aid and development system. But one of the key focus in this entire sort of 30+ year history is the connection with the roots, the connection with the local communities, across South Sudan, across Somalia, across Kenya, that we've been working on. And what was really transformational is, so in 2020, when we got the Mackenzie Scott gift, that was something actually Degan then took that money, invested it into real estate, and the money of which will then drive Adeso work. And there was this idea of, people talk about, if there's no place at the table, bring your own chair or whatever. And Degan was like, you have to bring your own money to the table. And remove this kind of notion of a very sort of a way of being, with what she calls, her words, not mine, being professional beggars. You are always at sort of the mercy of other people judging your work and giving your work into that. But how do we sort of own that narrative? And so it's been a 30+ year of sort of a journey of decolonizing the way that, like, she's done that work as well. And part of that, so we're also working on something called the Proximate Fund, which hopefully you'll all be hearing more about in the next couple of months. And this is, again, a fund that is bringing back, how do you have funding at scale for local proximate organizations? How do you bring trust back? One of the things we constantly hear is the sort of removal of trust, that you can't trust local organizations. They're probably corrupt. You don't know where your money is going. And so the work that we're doing through Kuja Link is one about access, about bringing CSOs and bringing funders together, but also helping them with a lot of the sort of back office work as well. They would actually deny them access to a lot of larger grants and so on. Where we're at right now, actually, the story of Adeso, the way it's developing, is it's moving from that NGO to a social enterprise. And the ambition of it is really looking at it as an African organization with global influence. And how do we now, we have the water project, and it's not just sort of like a NGO, just a little charity project that's bringing water to a little community somewhere, but it is monetizing it. And it is looking at plans of how do you make the community self-sufficient as well. So we've started to look at various businesses. And I think that is sort of this whole story of owning financial independence, going from being deeply entrenched into the weeds of being essentially a USAID organization to the journey that it has come from, has pretty much not only the work in the way that Adeso has done, but also in what we aim to do. So I'll stop here, but really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Masarat. So much rich and exciting, inspiring work that you shared there. Love the collaboration and the naming of trust, both the trust in local actors and expertise and wisdom that they bring, and kind of the project of colonialization as breaking down that trust in our own local wisdom, but also around self-sufficiency and financial independence, and really naming, you know, moving forward with that agency and power, and having folks really be central actors in the movement of wealth. So thank you, Musarat. I'm going to go to Omalara next, from the Liberation Alliance Africa. Omalara, are you on the line?
I am. Thank you so much. Because of a little unexpected internet struggle, my video will not be going up, but I'm here with you fully, and I love all the conversations we've had so far. I really resonate with, what Dylan said about reclaiming, reclaiming agency, reclaiming dignity, because we cannot pretend like, the legacies of enslavement and colonialism did not steal more than natural resources, did not steal, more than economic power. It did erode, mindsets, eroded cultures, ways of being, identity. Those are the things that we are reclaiming. And when you look at all of that, it is at the core of that, a people's agency, a people's sense of power, a people's sense of autonomy. So Liberation Alliance Africa is, my co-founder calls it an expression of radical hope. We are two Nigerian women who have decided that, we want to maintain this core, we want to maintain this hunger, this anger, this beautiful, this joy, and we want to do that in the company of other women and gender diverse persons on the continent. And so we are a decolonial feminist collective doing Pan-African critical consciousness raising through radical knowledge production, policy advocacy, decolonial feminist organizing, and we are here really to document the cultural evolution of our liberation. One of the things that we, that captures who we are is that we want to contribute to the disruption of colonial and patriarchal legacies that perpetuate oppression, exploitation, and exclusion. Because as women who are African women, we stand at an interesting intersection where we are not only, trying to decolonize ourselves and our countries, but we also need to look at how patriarchy is woven into this colonial giant machine of imperialism, right? And so it is for us really to tease out, our positionality within that space and push back as African women. One of the key things that we actually do is, the production of knowledge by African women. When you said earlier that who gets to produce knowledge, I just smiled, because one of the core parts of our work is epistemic agency. We recognize how enslavement, how colonialism, and its, sustained neocolonialism has impacted epistemic agency, has impacted who gets to know things, who gets to frame things. Many of the things that we actually work around in philanthropy at the moment is around agency, relationship, and sustainability, because we know that, philanthropy has its past in, colonial structures and legacies. For example, in Africa, we went through, the missionaries, and then we lived through structural adjustment programs that basically, reduced the powers of the government and left many people, falling through the cracks. And, through that, NGOs became super popular. who funds NGOs, philanthropic organizations. So there is definitely a power dynamic. There is definitely, you know, the idea. If somebody said something earlier in a webinar I was earlier about power and how power may not be directly connected to money. And I was like, woof, no, power, you know, begets money, you know, in some frames beget power, and power, you know, begets agency and autonomy. And if you don't have those things, you are on the other side of that. It's very simple. Some people have the money, some people don't. And if we want, we cannot treat that as a benign issue. Like, oh, it's just how the world works. That's not how the world works. There's a history to that. There is a legacy that continues to protect this inequality. And that is really what we are out here to question. So our work really expands beyond philanthropy, you know, because earlier this year, we started a 5-part series titled Disrupting Colonial Legacies in Africa. And we just bring into the room African feminist scholars, activists, students, everyone who is interested really, into conversation about, you know, tracing colonial legacies and how they impact our everyday lives. You know, it is James Baldwin who said something about trusting your experiences. He said, do not listen to what I tell you. You know, he said, trust your experiences. And on some level, we realize that, you know, the lack of epistemic agency arrange a situation where our experiences do not kind of form a part of what the prevailing rhetoric, the prevailing narrative is. And how do we change that? How do we become the framers of our own narratives and therefore the creators of our own destinies? And that's what we do. So we looked at leadership, we looked at climate, we've looked at economic justice, where we really center, you know, social reproduction and how women you know, get to grease this capitalist machine without so much as recognition or remuneration. And then, you know, most recently we are doing some work on philanthropy, basically doing those things, questioning structures that we might, you know, otherwise take for granted, questioning systems that look benign, but because your experiences do not match the narrative of a non-cancerous system, we have to draw patterns that allow our experiences to make sense in the grand scheme of things. And so Liberation Alliance Africa is this feminist collective where we kind of just ask these questions and challenge oppression and build the blocks of, you know, collective emancipation, basically creating our own realities so they can become our memories, gradually washing away memories that aren't ours, but continue to control our lives. So that's kind of who we are and the space that we occupy. Thank you.
Thank you, Omalara. Wow, so much rich wisdom. Thank you so much for sharing. I just really love this this idea of disrupting the narratives and telling the story of the cultural revolution of our liberation. What you spoke to, Omalara, really speaks to the reclamation, the dismantling and the reclamation that Dylan mentioned, and the truth-telling that has been a thread throughout all of this. So just big appreciation to you for your work. The intersectional lens that you and the Liberation Alliance Africa bring is critical to this conversation. So thank you very much. Last but certainly not least, I would like to invite Jonathan from the Comua Network. Are you on the line?
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'll take this opportunity and thank Jenny for asking this, but I'll be speaking in Portuguese, so I'll give you some time to change here the channel for interpretation, the language that you prefer. É prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje. Conseguir falar na minha língua nativa, de certa maneira, isso também é uma prática decolonial, então, de novo, reforçar.
This is I thank you for the opportunity of speaking Portuguese, and I want to tell you a little bit about our work in the Brazilian context. And the network and the members have been talking about decolonization for at least 10 years ago, and I'm going to share this with you. It's very important for me to share these spaces with you. It's important to talk a little bit about the Brazilian context first. Carlos has talked a little bit about this, but In Brazil, it is very evident how we're still suffering from this legacy of colonialism and racism. And we're talking about a country that still refuses to look at the legacy of these violences in its population, particularly Black, Indigenous, women, LGBTIQ plus population, and other populations. It is impossible to not talk about philanthropy in our country without looking at that legacy of colonialism and racism. We're talking about the last country to abolish slave work in the Americas. It's a country that continues to deny to look at its past and fight for effective change. And that is a repairing or redressing change. So in Brazilian philanthropy is the same goes, and legacy of colonialism is evident. So we see that Brazilian philanthropy is comprised of organizations of millionaire families from Brazil, but also corporations that would rather execute their own projects than support the social movements and collective movements and that are already at the front line of social transformation and in the fight against these legacies. So we're talking about a philanthropy that fails to recognize the importance and the power of these civil society sectors in transformation process, and which also systematically refuses to reassess these practices and think how these practices are being taken on and strengthening the oppression system. And the kind of the putting down of so many people in our country. It's also a thing that we must talk about, a wide heterosexual sector that establishes a philanthropic system that perpetuates the legacy of this colonialism. So we sometimes see families that donate, donate to each other, or they just don't donate explicitly to civil society. When we talk about the GFCF census, this is a corporate family philanthropy organization, and other actors hold a census every 2 years. In the 2020 census, they show that 5% of philanthropic organizations are directly funding initiatives towards racial issues. 9% are initiatives for women. 3% are for LGBTIQ plus communities. 4% are persons with disabilities. This is just an example to show you how, despite philanthropy and the fact that we're talking about decolonization, these practices are still not changing. We will soon have the 2022 census in our hands, and we will have updated numbers, but from what we're seeing here, from the trends, we don't believe that's going to change very much. I wanted to use this time, some few minutes, to talk about the work of our network and its members. We were trying to find new ways of doing philanthropy. We like to talk about cultural philanthropy because there's not one single model of philanthropy. If philanthropy can be committed to social justice, to actual transformation, and to social movements. And this is seen in our country. So our network is comprised of 6 organizations of independent philanthropy, many of them created by activists and persons related to the social movement, which provide financial donations, but also non-financial support for civil society organizations. And the purpose is to strengthen the fight and access to rights of political minorities and also strengthen democracy in this country. Only in 2022, the members of this network mobilized over 190 million reais, and when we look at the support areas, we also did a mapping last year where we did a first major assessment, a sort of snapshot of who is doing independent philanthropy, and we mapped it out also we also mapped out how it's going in our 16 members and other persons who work with our members, and we saw that 74% of the support is institutional, that is from civil society organizations. How can we talk about another type of philanthropy if we don't guarantee the survival of organizations and movements? That is our commitment, and the commitment of ours and other independent philanthropy organizations. It's followed by gender, 48%, culture, 48%, community movement, 42%, agriculture, agroecology, 39%, and it's also indigenous communities and other traditional communities, 35%. So just to use these numbers to compare, we see the role and that the power that these philanthropies have that are represented by independent parties. And when we look at the public, 71%, 75% are civil society organizations, 71% are for collectives, 74% for cooperatives, and also for leaderships and human rights communicators. So the network gathers these organizations and these philanthropies. There is already a sort of ancestral philanthropy that we seek to use to strengthen the actual philanthropy that exists in our country already. And it should be valued within the network as, okay, it has the role of producing knowledge and showing the possibilities of these different approaches to philanthropies. So we're talking about philanthropies in plural, and we're trying to identify the different practices that connect the different stakeholders. So it's about assessing, evaluating the communities, looking at their networks, their capacities, their competencies, and the autonomy. And a philanthropy that these communities should be thinking of, instead of continuing to be under some harmful practices and ways of doing things. And we are prioritizing minority population issues, as well as philanthropy that can help us create new mechanisms to guarantee the access of these people, these organizations, and these movements to resources. We're talking about democratizing access to resources in a much more horizontal manner so that we're able to strengthen the struggle. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to be sharing some tips and figures on the chat, and I invite you to find out about the work of our organizations. We have some members that are present here, such as some funds, environmental and nature funds. And we also have knowledge production work, decolonization and knowledge production, and knowledge about the work of philanthropy. These are two of our participants of some of our organizations, Larissa and Clever. And well, thank you for having me, and I'm available for any questions or anything you may want to talk about with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Oh, goodness, there's just the facts and figures you shared around the ways in which wealth is hoarded and how your network is working to redistribute that is really powerful work. We are so lucky to be joined here today by these incredible leaders. And I just want to lift up a few themes before we shift to our next section. So we really heard today about the power of disruption, reclamation, repair, and redistribution, and that through this work that we're actually collectively reimagining and, as you said, Jonathan, democratizing these resources in powerful ways, and that these are, as Omolara said, practices of radical hope. And as Carlos said, like really modeling what philanthropy can look like in the global context across philanthropy, government, international cooperation. And we heard so many tangible examples today of what this really looks like in action. So we're going to take pen to paper together today, and we have a Jamboard that we're going to put in the chat. And we want to invite everyone to share your perspectives and your experiences on a few different topics. So the first page, you'll see on the left-hand side a little sticky note that you can click and add your comment. We want to hear, what are you hearing and learning about decolonizing in your context, wherever you may be calling in from today. Then you're going to go to the top, and there's a second slide with a second prompt that says, what blockages and challenges do you see in efforts to decolonize international cooperation globally? So where are things, where are you encountering challenges? And then the third question is, what are you hearing from funders and governments about the decolonization of monetary flows internationally? So we want to give everyone a few minutes. I would love if we can put on our music again, who's ever got the music controls, and we're going to give everyone a few minutes to pop into the Jamboard and just share a few of your thoughts. Is that clear? Any questions? The prompts are in the chat and at the top of each slide. Thank you, Jasmine, for sharing your screen. So we're just going to take a few minutes to add your thoughts, please. And we can feel free to put them in whatever language is most comfortable to you, and we can work on translation on our end. Any questions? I see a couple folks popping in. Thank you so much. So you're going to click on the sticky note on the left-hand side. We'll give everyone a few minutes. Thank you. Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. If you're not able to access it, feel free to put your comment in the chat and we will transfer it over. Sorry about that, Yasmin. Thank you for letting us know. So feel free to put your comment in the chat if you're not able to put it on the Jamboard, and we'll transfer it over for you. Lots of great comments getting added. Let's take just a couple more minutes. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you, Jasmine, for the wonderful music. Thank you so much. Yes, getting us all ready for Bogota. Thank you, everyone who's added comments to the chat. Sorry, to the Jamboard and to the chat. I was just seeing the comments coming through there as well. So thank you. I'm going to start with the first slide. So we're seeing themes around what was mentioned earlier, decolonization, meaning different things to different people, and really needing to kind of clarify what this looks like in practice. Thank you for putting that up on the screen. And we're seeing that even those who do say they understand it are having a hard time actually changing their practices. So what does decolonization actually look like in active practice? It's different than just saying the words, but really being clear about what the actual specific practices are that undergird decolonization efforts. We see that these practices involve changing established patterns and actually being open and interested in the term itself and how it's defined. Folks have shared that there's some resistance to the power, to the word itself, and that without the meaningful definition and practices to go behind it, runs the risk of just being rhetoric. So we're seeing those who are our colleagues in Palestine who are, actually experiencing colonization and ethnic cleansing right now, and seeing that the calls for liberation are being weaponized as well. And that in some cases, the practice is actually putting together networks and hubs of actors that can do the work together. And we heard this from the conversation earlier today, that actually building a movement for this work is critical. That, you know, in many cases it can be risky to use the term decolonization or to push back, and that there's actually strength in numbers, that we're building a movement that can actually put the pressure on to shift these practices in really critical ways. We're seeing here in the comments that the actual decolonization of development aid should look like not having the system, that the money should flow to local actors directly, and that engaging in these trust-based practices and shifting power to local actors could, you know, negate the need for the system of global aid as well. So we're seeing some powerful sentiments here, and I just want to invite any of our speakers or anyone else, if there's anything that you'd like to speak to here, anyone that added to this slide. Yes, Masarat.
You know, I think when we have this conversation, and to my sort of earlier point about how we are still at a stage where different people understand this very differently. And when I say that, I'm going to pop this link in the chat. So, for example, I read this piece a couple of weeks ago. Decolonization in the Indian context actually connects with the right-wing Hindutva ideology, where, you know, let's undo what the British did to us, but that is basically taking the discourse in the country to let's go back to a time of purity when we didn't have any Muslim invaders and we only had Hindu kings. And so the entire narrative is so skewed that decolonization in that context will be very different to some of the things that we have in the stickies over here. So I feel because we're just at such, we have to appreciate the context where we're having this decolonization conversation. And within that context, what are those local concerns within that? There are sort of global concerns that it's a trap. We get into it. We end up completely connecting with a topic based on whatever the global narrative is. But locally, what is that actually, what are the topics that come up then? I think just to be mindful of, you know, I always look at questions and I say, who is asking this question? So just looking and appreciating contexts, I think, is a very important part as we start sort of talking and unpacking decolonization.
Thank you, Masarat. That's such a great point, and thank you for that article. It really points to how it's defined in different spaces and what critical difference that can make. Dylan, did you want to jump in?
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, I would. It's fascinating to read some of these comments, and I agree that it's hard, and that, you know, there are a lot of people who might be saying the right thing but not really doing anything. I was particularly struck by the sticky note that says we have a gap but no bridge, which I thought was a beautifully eloquent way of describing the problem that we have right now. But I want to just offer another perspective here. First, to say that I think, to speak to what Carlos said at the very beginning, he said we need to make what is hidden, make it more explicit. So while there is a gap, or there's a problem that is articulated in the system right now, not enough people recognize it as a problem. So maybe what we first need to do is open the gap, actually, or at least shine a light on the gap more. Right? So that's the first thing. All of us have a responsibility to do that. And I think, as I mentioned when I was talking initially, that right now, part of the challenges is that people are afraid to talk about this and to name it. So we need to think about how to protect each other and be allies to each other. So when we name it, we don't feel under fire or feel that we are at risk of being cast out into the wilderness and not have the opportunity of engaging. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think a bridge is forming. And the bridge is forming because, so let me just give you an example of some of the work that we've been doing. Since we've been talking about this, we've tried to expose this gap, this problem in the system. And we have arranged the changes that need to happen into 3 baskets. The first basket is around sort of mindsets and worldviews, so really challenging people's fundamental assumptions about, their own expertise, their understanding of the power in the system and where it sits, and their acknowledgement of structural racism. That's the first thing. The second thing is around then attitudes, and really then helping people understand how those mindsets need to shift, need to change, and those will influence attitudes around how they value, for example, Indigenous knowledge, how they value, different types of input and expertise. And then there's a third basket, which is around practice. And most donors and policymakers just want a quick fix, right? We know that. They jump straight to practice. And we've said, look, there are lots of things that you could do in terms of practice. You could fund more courageously. You can reduce your due diligence processes. You can seed, power in decision-making around how you make certain decisions. So all of those things. But you can't do that in isolation from those other two baskets. If you try and make changes to practice quickly, without changes to your mindsets, your worldviews, and your attitudes, you're going to fail. And I think that's what we've seen with things like the Grand Bargain, is these commitments that were made, which are around practice, but not really digging into the underlying assumptions. And one of the bridges that we've seen work very well is that we've encouraged INGOs. So we've been talking a lot about wealth and philanthropy, but also there's a big problem with how INGOs operate, particularly those INGOs that have country offices. And what we've been talking to INGOs about is adopt a transition mindset. Imagine yourself not doing what you're doing right now. Imagine that you build that into your strategy so that rather than getting bigger, you get smaller. Imagine what that might look like if you stop doing some of the work that you do because you don't need to do it anymore, because you didn't really need to do that for the last 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And adopting that transition mindset is something that I've seen some very large INGOs have started to think about. They've started to look at their own strategy and say, why are we having a strategy that is predicated on growth and doing more when actually you should be doing less and shrinking our role? And they've now started to change their strategy. Why are we still having country offices that operate the same way? Why are we producing knowledge and consuming knowledge here when actually we could just be investing in knowledge production and consumption in the communities and the countries where we're trying to help? So I think that idea of adopting a transition mindset, I think, is really helpful for organizations, because it starts shifting them away from I am here to do a certain thing to saying, I don't need to do this anymore, and I need to figure out how the steps I take to move from where I am now to a role in which I play much more of an ally role. So the bridge is starting to be built. It might not feel very visible to many people, but we're lucky enough to have conversations, as I said, with INGOs, donors, policymakers. We're starting to see some changes.
Thank you, Dylan, for offering the glimmer of hope. Appreciate that. It's helpful to hear examples of where this is happening effectively. I'd like to shift us, in the interest of time, just to the second slide. So what blockages and challenges do we see in the efforts to decolonize international cooperation globally? And we're seeing a few themes here. One is power. The challenge of global North actors and governments to give up the power. And this shows up in a variety of different ways, but ultimately comes down to, privilege and folks being comfortable in systems of privilege that are perpetuating these dynamics. Another theme we see is around risk, and that, there's risk being named here. I want to point to the sticky that I saw. Hold on. Up here, a narrowly defined understanding of risk that doesn't adequately account for the multiple risks of continuing with the status quo. So there's both this conversation around risk is on both sides. In some cases, folks who receive funding and the risk of calling out funders and having funding being compromised. But then there's also the risk of not calling it out and having the system continue. And Carlos, in our last session, you spoke about decolonizing wealth work around liberated capital. And you know, the belief that we are not just liberating the resources, but we are liberating the people who are holding them as well, and that they are healing too from these systems, and that if we don't approach this with urgency, that we run the risk of just continually being caught in this cycle. The people talking the talk, but not necessarily walking it. So again, speaking to those practices that are critical to making this happen. I also want to name the where the money is coming from piece, which feels critical, naming the origins of wealth as a critical step on this path this person is questioning why would they want to give away their power. So how do we push funders for real change? I think in some of our work, we've seen that helping people tell the story, helping people really understand that the wealth is not theirs, that it has been extracted and stolen in some cases, can be a realization. It's part of, like you said, helping people recognize the problem and making the invisible visible. So just a lot of really great themes coming out here. And I want to invite any of our speakers or anyone else on the call to speak to anything on this slide. Oh, we lost it. Jasmine, are you able to put it back up? Just in case folks aren't able to see the Jamboard. Thank you, Jasmine. So anyone want to speak to any of the themes, the challenges and blockages that we're seeing?
I don't want to hog the conversation, Amber, but I'll make a super quick point to pace. I find ourselves to be sort of a lot of times in the whirlpool of the same talking points. Everybody has been saying the same things, whether at UNGA or all these kind of events. So there's something here about how do we expedite the pace of the decolonization efforts, whether it's even localization. How do we just kind of, and it's not even incremental, but how do we do that in a much more exponential way?
Thank you, Masrat. Yes, I'm definitely, the urgency is there. The urgency is there. And I think that's a helpful bridge into our next and final part of the conversation. But just want to invite anyone else who would like to share. Jonathan, yeah.
So I was the one that left that gap comment on the last thing, and I just kind of wanted to loop it to what we're looking at here. Just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Frances. I'm the co-founder of Omnipolis. It's a social enterprise that's focused on, giving agency to people of color in the new kind of green economy. And I'm also an industrial designer, and I was just kind of, I just thought it was very interesting, the last slide and this slide, and how they were connected in terms of the gap and the pace. And I found it very interesting what you said, Amber, about the speed and urgency and, trying to outrun the deleterious effects. So it's just kind of interesting when you have to balance the sense of having to innovate with, the sense of trying to reclaim something. So I feel like there's this fine balance of when trying to build a bridge, being able to use the past and anchor yourself and root yourself to that, while at the same time innovating in a forward motion, because the only way to really build, just from my experience in industry, is the only way to outpace your competitor is to really out innovate them. So it also seems like there needs to be not only a sense of urgency, but a sense of urgency to kind of compete in terms of social innovation and creating almost like an alternative sense of value to that.
Thank you, Frances. It's a really great point that we are quite literally building the bridge, and that requires us to take. I think we are the bridge ultimately, and that requires us to reimagine new practices. Jonathan, yes.
Yes, I'll go back to Portuguese, guys, so change your channel, please. Eu acho que um outro desafio também que é importante a gente trazer, eu percebi também aqui em alguns dos post-its, né? É um desafio que a gente está enfrentado aqui no Brasil.
I also perceive that we in Brazil are in the work that we do, we're precisely facing this this notion of a short agenda or the agenda that have been disrupted by philanthropy actors that say they are promoting decolonization, but when we look at the practice, that is not the case. So I believe that's another challenge that we face, and we have explored new ways of first reinforcing our narrative, show what we're doing, what we're talking about when we're talking about this, and what is the transformation, what the members of the networks are proposing, but also we try to propose alliances and collaborations. So for instance, we have some associations and alliances, and we have worked jointly with the agencies from 8 countries, and we are trying to talk this out in meetings, and we're trying to build this emerging system. And we see that the possibility, or we're looking at the possibility of finding new alliances at the global level. But I believe that these things that we're talking about shed light on the challenges and on what we are really lacking. We were talking about discrimination and violence and colonialism, but also the fact that we need to strengthen the narratives that we have already promoted and made some progress on, and strengthen true collaboration among actors that are striving for transformation.
Thank you, Jonathan. I love that you're pointing to us towards some of these practices that can really help put this into practice. Omolara, yes.
Yes, please. Thank you. I just want to share reflections from, one of the things that I'm trying to pronounce, Maserat. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Yes. I'm trying to, when you spoke earlier about, right wing, and I use that loosely because where I'm from is not particularly right wing in that sense, but when you find out that fundamentalists co-opt the language of, liberatory practices and use them to further, their agenda. For example, people saying things like, what the example you made in terms of, decolonization, let's go back to where we were before, this sense of purity or whatnot. But I think that, and then you speak directly from that to kind of like the meaning, like what is the ethos of the idea of decolonization. And I wanted to share some reflection in terms of that. I think that decolonization really is us kind of unpacking based on our lived experiences and building, kind of unpacking, removing, and then reconstructing and rebuilding, this framework that allows us to live in this new reality. It is not particularly the going back to how things were before disruption. It is reclaiming the ownership of the narrative. It is reclaiming, and really that means so many different things to so many different people. And so if we start from that starting point where we are saying that this conversation is about retracing, is about unpacking, is about it's about healing, it's about rebuilding and reconstructing, then people make decisions based, on what those things really mean for their particular experiences. And, I wanted to chime in terms of the idea that, INGOs and international corporations use language that allow them. It's the same principle. Whoever is being questioned, queried, being pressed in terms of, challenging them to look at themselves. It is so difficult to look at oneself because it is the primary site of liberation. Yourself is the primary site of this rethinking, of this rebuilding, of this unpacking. And we must recognize that it is really painful to unpack. Now, that doesn't mean that we will stop the fight to unpack. It is that we know that it is a painful process, but you know, like African moms, we know it is good for you, so you're gonna manage the process. So it's really important for us to make it clear that we understand that there is a co-option of language, there is a co-option of, like, you know, movements, but when we discuss, we understand that this is where we stand, and that co-option, we basically make it like, I don't want to use the word powerless, but kind of do not allow it to sensitize us as much as they feel like it needs to, but continue to stand firm on the ideals that, you know, there is proven legacies of colonial structures of power. You happen to be occupying that space of power. Therefore, there is a need for you to not only unpack, and also, you know, we are ready to support you to do the unpacking, right? So when I think about, you know, how we decolonize, it is really, you know, I always give three things, and usually from place to place they change. Don't mind me, but like I always say 3 things. There is a need for like an awakening. You know, people think, oh yeah, we've been doing awareness raising, but you know, feminist pedagogy of awareness raising is lifting people from a place of their current consciousness and taking them to a place of a different consciousness that allows them to act differently. So the origins of our work in terms of what decolonization means is to do the critical consciousness work both on ourselves. You know why we find that people, you know, tend to say the things that they don't mean. I always say that the only thing that the entire world agrees upon is hypocrisy. And you know, every corner of the world, you find that people are more comfortable saying things than doing them. In my work as a liberation worker, I don't believe that, you know, we will definitely make clear lines, but it is important to understand that people find it difficult to look at themselves, including myself. It's such a difficult task to do. And so therefore, if we are able to cross the line of treating ourselves as the primary site, then it will affect how we move into other spaces. And so we are able to be in a position where we can demand that of other people. And this is not to speak to the extra labor that is placed on Black people and people of color to prove themselves, because I always say that the burden of morality is always on the powerless, it's always on the person who doesn't have agency. People with power and money and class do not subscribe to the rules of morality. So that is not what I'm speaking to. I'm speaking to the ideals that there is a level of internalized structural, you know, like ways of looking at ourselves and our work. When we are able to kind of address those internalized structures, we are able to move into a place of critical consciousness, helping others to move from a place of maybe low or desensitization to a place where their consciousness around the issue is important. You know, somebody made a comment about there is no bridge. And it was really important to me to think that, you know what, we right here as we are here at the bridge, the fact that this conversation is happening in a transnational platform where I'm getting to talk to people from other parts of the world who are doing this work within their spaces, we are building those bridges. And that brings me to the next thing that I think, you know, we can do in terms of decolonizing international corporations. It is the building of critical mass. We feminists love to build a movement, right? And I do believe that, you know, there is a part of this work that comes from critical consciousness raising to the building of a critical mass where the knowledge becomes normalized. That is where the ideas around, you know, framing the narratives, you know, come from. It is that this is what we mean by decolonization within this space. And this is, you know, and these are the ways we're going to go through them. When that becomes public knowledge, then we move to kind of like action. Now, what do we do with this critical knowledge that we have achieved and this critical mass of people, you know, of knowledge that we have gathered? Then we act with that and hold, you know, these international corporations, accountable. The process of accountability, and we must know that that is not going to cost us something. It is going to cost you, because at the end of the day, pity, sympathy, all of that are just emotions that you can extend to situation, but it won't cost you. But solidarity is going to cost you something. So when I think of how do we decolonize, it goes from awareness to kind of like framing, and in the framing of these narratives, be aware of the micro power dynamics that exist even amongst oppressed peoples. Because this is not just a them versus us situation. It is a them within us, amongst us, against them. It is multifaceted, because even in the spaces, where we are working to decolonize, there is still power imbalances, there is still power dynamics that if we are honest about, we are able to kind of put at bay, so that then when we start to determine whose knowledge, when we start to determine who is framing the conversation, when we start to determine what does this mean for us, it is not that we're going to replicate a system that we are working against amongst ourselves as we proceed, right? So there is that consciousness that we must have, both on the external level of movement, against continued legacies of colonization, but even within that movement, it's important for us to also be aware of the power dynamics that come from, literally environment, difference in whatever it is that makes us different, and call those things into attention and ensure that we are not building, we're not building a movement that cannot stand on its own, but we are able to actually answer some of these deep questions for ourselves, and then build a coalition, loose terms now, that can actually do the work and ensure that everybody's knowledge. And when I say everybody's knowledge, I mean that different ways of practices, different ways of knowing, pluriversal indigenous approaches to these kinds of things, bridging the gap between ideology and practice, between analysis and the practice actually of this liberation. I think that those are. So the bridge is not only about starting the conversation, the bridge is also in building, linkages between pedagogy and reality, between knowledge and practice, between analysis and the sustenance of a movement that can actually, do the work of decolonizing on a transnational level, while respecting everybody's kind of like, individual experiences within that framework.
So much good wisdom, Omolara. Thank you so much for sharing. I just want to lift up, I know we only have a couple more minutes, but self is the site of liberation. Yes, looking in the mirror, not just looking out the window. Thank you for lifting that up. And also to your point around building critical mass, that's what we're here to do. And just want to lift up that, in so doing, yes, there are these micro power dynamics that are happening. And so how do we work together in solidarity by naming, continuing to make the invisible visible? And so as we wrap up, I just want to invite a couple more folks. So we've started to lift up the conversations that we want to have, that we need to have in Bogota. And so we've heard about alliances and collaborations, strengthening narratives. We've heard reclaiming narratives and retracing those narratives and reclaiming them and reimagining them moving forward. But I just want to invite Masarat, Jonathan, or any others who want to chime in on if we were going to have one conversation in Bogota, what would that be? So Masarat, Jonathan, anything you would add quickly before we wrap? Based on today, what are the critical conversations that we need to have in Bogota?
Eu diria a gente olhar para essas nossas práticas mesmo, né? Já existem as práticas, elas estão aí, elas estão acontecendo. Eu acho que agora é o momento da gente fortalecer mesmo essa colaboração em outros termos, em outras dinâmicas, em
I
outras
think we need to strengthen our collaboration and the way of doing things, and we need to show that there are different paths and different alternatives. I believe that it's good to look at to consider the construction of this new system.
I'll
Thank you,
quickly
Jonathan.
add. I think a lot of times in these conversations, I always tend to think of education, and I think of how do we kind of use this as a way to, not everybody maybe feels informed enough to take a stand, informed enough to know, well, I understand this and I really empathize with this, but what does it mean for me? What does it mean for my organization? And I wonder if we can make some space in Bogota for learning together, for sort of coming into a psychologically safe space where, it's okay if we're all on different levels of it, but how can we learn together? How can we ask questions? I think that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you. Great ideas. Carlos, Dylan, anything that you would add?
Go ahead, Dylan.
Sorry, Carlos. Just to say, I think I agree with all what's just been said. I would add to that is the building the critical mass. I think right now what we are hearing, both in the morning session and this session, is there are disparate strands of effort, somewhat isolated from each other. And I think we need to, and I think, the whole spirit of the road to Bogota has been about weaving, hasn't it? It's about trying to understand the linkages between the different efforts that all aim towards building a different type of world that we can be, we can look forward to and build a different type of international cooperation. So I think we need to intentionally look at how do we enshrine that spirit of weaving between the different themes and move out of our silos and recognize the allies that we have in different spaces and places. And then we'll probably have the critical mass. We may already have it, we just don't recognize it. I think that's part of the issue for me, is we may already have the critical mass, but it is sitting in different spaces and not yet joined up.
Thank you, Dylan. I see a couple hands raised. I know we're at time. So I apologize that we won't get to everybody today. Jenny, I know we're wrapping up. Should I pass it over to you?
Yeah, let's maybe pass quickly to Mukhtar. I'll give my time to Mukhtar.
Okay, great. Mukhtar, come on in.
Thank you, Jenny. No, just amazing listening to all of you is just so inspiring. Really, this question of if there was one thing to do in Bogota, I really, I believe, 10 years into building actually a community of practice and critical analysis around these topics, I think has been incredible. There is incredible knowledge, there's incredible leadership, and I do think that if there's one thing that we need to do is actually build an ecosystem and an architecture of political organizing. It is so crucial for us to actually think about this as a moment of political organizing that requires a strategy, the toolkits, the various bodies of intervention. I think we have incredible knowledge, we have incredible critique and analysis of the situation. There are incredible solutions, but without an apparatus and a vision and a strategy for political organizing, it would be very difficult. We could be just spending our time doing this again and again. And, my generation will kind of go fishing, and then the next generation will, spin on around these issues again. And I just feel that the critical mass is important. It's an essential element in then building the political organizing platform and a vision and a strategy and the ecosystem for political organizing around these issues. So thank you, Jenny, for giving me your time. I'm sorry, I've lost my voice. I've been in too many demos in the last few days.
Thank you, Mukhtar. It's a fantastic point, and one that I hope we can continue to build that infrastructure together in Bogota. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time today. And we look forward to seeing you in Bogota and elsewhere and being in continued conversation. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. And thank you to our amazing speakers and guests today. We
Thank you.
appreciate you so
Obrigado.
much. Thank you.